Japan, 2019. Part 1. Shadows over Nagano. The crisp mountain air of Nagano always carried a sense of purity, but this winter it felt oppressive. The snow, once a symbol of serenity, now blanketed the village like a heavy weight, suffocating the joy out of its inhabitants. Among them was Mika, a devout Christian living in the quiet village where Christianity, though respected, existed in the shadow of centuries-old traditions and beliefs. The local shrines and temples stood proudly against the backdrop of the snowy mountains, guardians of ancient faiths that many villagers still held dear. But Mika's faith was her compass, guiding her through life's trials and tribulations. At 25, Mika had always been known for her quiet strength. With deep brown eyes and dark, raven-black hair that fell neatly over her shoulders, she carried herself with a dignity and grace that had earned her respect in the community. She had grown up with her younger brother, Hiroshi, under the watchful eye of their grandmother, who had taught them both the ways of Christian faith. Their parents had passed away when they were children, victims of a tragic accident during a pilgrimage, leaving Mika as both sister and mother to Hiroshi. Their bond was unshakable, or so she believed. Hiroshi had always been the light in Mika's life. At 21, he was once full of energy, mischievous grins, and a thirst for adventure. The village, with its snow-covered streets and small clusters of wooden homes, had always felt too small for his ambitions. Hiroshi dreamed of seeing the world, of breaking free from the traditions that surrounded him. He was curious, a free spirit. But as the cold winds of winter swept through Nagano, something began to change in him. His laughter, once so contagious, became rare. His smile faded into a hollow expression, and his once bright eyes grew distant, as though he was looking at something only he could see. Mika first noticed the shift during the village's annual autumn festival. The streets had been alive with vibrant colors, paper lanterns swinging gently in the breeze, and children laughing as they ran through the snow. Hiroshi, usually at the center of it all, had stood off to the side, his face pale and drawn. Mika had approached him, her brow furrowed in concern. "Hiroshi, are you okay?" she asked, reaching out to touch his arm. He had flinched at her touch, pulling away as though her hand burned him. "I'm fine, Mika," he said, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes refusing to meet hers. But there was something wrong, something Mika couldn't shake. As the weeks passed, Hiroshi became more withdrawn. He spent hours locked in his room, speaking to no one, barely eating. At night, Mika could hear strange noises from behind his door. Low murmurs, sometimes laughter, but it was the kind of laughter that sent chills down her spine. It wasn't Hiroshi's voice anymore. One cold evening, Mika knocked on his door, her heart pounding. "Hiroshi," she called softly. "Can we talk?" There was no answer, only silence. Slowly, she opened the door, her breath catching in her throat as she stepped inside. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the frost-covered window. Hiroshi sat in the corner, his back to her, muttering under his breath. His shoulders were hunched, and his hair fell in disarray over his face. "Hiroshi," Mika's voice trembled as she approached him. Without warning, he turned to face her. His eyes, once warm and full of life, were now cold and empty. His lips curled into a twisted smile, but it wasn't the smile she knew. "Leave," he whispered, his voice harsh and guttural. "You shouldn't be here." Mika stumbled back, her heart racing. "What's happening to you, Hiroshi? Please, talk to me." But Hiroshi only laughed, a hollow, cruel sound that echoed in the small room. "You can't help me," he said, his voice barely recognizable. "No one can." Mika felt a surge of fear unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was as though the very air in the room had thickened, pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe. Her brother, the boy she had raised and loved, was slipping away, and she didn't know how to save him. Over the next few days, Mika's desperation grew. She sought help from the village's small clinic, hoping that a doctor could explain Hiroshi's behavior. But the medical professionals found nothing wrong. It's psychological, they had said stress, perhaps. But Mika knew better. This was no ordinary illness. Something dark had taken hold of Hiroshi, and it was growing stronger by the day. Desperate for answers, Mika turned to the local priest, Father Takashi, a kind man who had served their small Christian community for years. She approached him after service one Sunday, her hands trembling as she explained Hiroshi's strange behavior. Father Takashi listened patiently, his face grave. "Mika," he said gently, "I have seen many things in my time, but this, it sounds like something far beyond our understanding. Perhaps it is not a matter of faith, but of the spirits of the mountain." Mika's heart sank. The priest's words were not what she had hoped to hear. "But Father," she pleaded, "I need your help. I need God's help. Please come to our home, pray with me." Father Takashi hesitated, his eyes filled with doubt. "The mountain is old, Mika, older than our faith. There are things here that even I cannot face." With those words, Mika felt the weight of the world pressing down on her. The one person she had hoped would guide her, the spiritual leader of their community, had turned away. Alone and with no answers, Mika returned home, her heart heavy with fear. Inside the house, the air was cold and still. Hiroshi's door remained closed, but Mika could hear the unsettling sounds of his muttering. She sank to her knees in the small family shrine, clutching her Bible to her chest, her hands shaking as she began to pray. "Please, God," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Help me. Help Hiroshi. I don't know what to do." For hours, she remained there, praying until her voice grew hoarse, until her knees ached from the cold floor. But the only answer was the wind howling outside and the faint laughter coming from Hiroshi's room. As night fell, the house seemed to grow colder. Mika lit a fire in the hearth, but even the warmth of the flames couldn't chase away the creeping darkness that seemed to settle over everything. She sat by the fire, her mind racing, replaying every moment, every word Hiroshi had spoken, trying to find some explanation, some way to reach him. But deep down, Mika knew the truth. This wasn't something she could understand with reason. This was something far darker, something beyond the world she knew. And as the wind howled outside, as the snow fell heavier, Mika realized with a sinking feeling that she might be facing something far more terrifying than she had ever imagined. In the quiet of the night, as the fire crackled softly, Mika closed her eyes and whispered a final prayer. "God, if you're listening, please show me the way." The air seemed to still, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of hope in Mika's heart. Part 2. The Descent. The snow continued to fall heavily outside, the wind howling against the thin walls of the house. Inside, the air was thick with tension, the warmth of the fire in the hearth doing little to dispel the creeping cold that had settled in Mika's heart. She stood before the door to Hiroshi's room, her breath shallow, her hands trembling. For days, she had prayed, fasted, and begged for an answer. But nothing had come, and Hiroshi's condition had only worsened. The door loomed before her like a barrier, not just of wood, but of something darker. The very air around it seemed different, heavier, as if the room itself was a different place, cut off from the rest of the house, from the world Mika knew. She had heard him, or rather, whatever was inside him, muttering late into the night, voices that seemed to come from a depth far beyond her understanding. Mika had tried to convince herself that it was still her brother in there, that the boy she had raised, who had once filled their home with laughter, was simply sick. But every time she approached the door, every time she heard those guttural whispers, her heart filled with a fear she couldn't name. It wasn't just illness, something much darker had taken root. Summoning every ounce of courage she could muster, Mika pushed the door open slowly. The wooden frame creaked ominously, and the cold from the room hit her like a wave. It was as if no warmth could penetrate this place anymore. The curtains were drawn, casting deep shadows across the room, and the air smelled musty, damp, as if the space had been untouched for months. Hiroshi sat on the bed, his back hunched over, his head hanging low. He was a mere shadow of the person he had once been, His black hair hung over his face, unkempt and greasy, his skin pale, almost translucent under the faint light that trickled through the cracks in the curtains. The once vibrant young man who had been so full of life now sat motionless, silent, like a broken doll. "Hiroshi," Mika whispered, her voice barely audible. She took a hesitant step forward, her feet feeling heavy as if the very air resisted her movement. For a moment, Hiroshi didn't respond. His body remained still, too still. The silence in the room was unnerving, the kind that made the hairs on the back of Mika's neck stand on end. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, to shut the door and run. But her heart, the part of her that still loved her brother, refused to let her go. "Hiroshi, can you hear me?" she asked, her voice a little stronger now, though fear still gripped her tightly. "Please, I just want to help." Slowly, agonizingly slowly, Hiroshi turned his head towards her. As his face came into view, Mika felt her stomach churn. His eyes, once filled with warmth and mischief, were now dark, almost black, hollow like endless voids. His skin, stretched tightly over his bones, had a sickly sheen, and his lips were cracked, curled into a mockery of a smile that sent shivers down Mika's spine. "Help!" The voice that came from Hiroshi was not his own. It was deep, raspy, as though it had crawled up from the depths of something ancient and malevolent. "You cannot help me, sister." Mika took an involuntary step back, her heart hammering in her chest. "Hiroshi, please, I know you're still in there," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Whatever this is, it's not you. You have to fight it." But Hiroshi's smile only widened, his dark eyes gleaming with a twisted amusement. "He's gone, Mika," the voice hissed, as if enjoying her pain. "He belongs to me now." The word sent a chill through Mika, colder than any winter wind. She had heard of stories like this, whispered tales of possession, of spirits that took hold of people, bending them to their will. But she had never believed them, until now. Her legs felt weak, and she stumbled backward, her hands instinctively clutching the cross necklace around her neck. "No," she whispered, shaking her head as if denying the reality before her would somehow make it go away. "No, this isn't real. You're my brother. You're Hiroshi. This thing inside you, it's lying." The figure that was once Hiroshi tilted its head, eyes narrowing as it examined her with a disturbing, predatory gaze. "You still don't understand, do you?" it said, the voice low and menacing, like a growl deep in the throat of a beast. "There's no saving him. Your prayers, your faith, they mean nothing here." Mika's heart raced as she backed away, her feet stumbling over the uneven floor. Tears welled up in her eyes, blurring her vision. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs felt like lead, her body frozen by fear and disbelief. How had it come to this? How had her brother fallen so far into the clutches of this evil? Summoning every ounce of courage she had left, Mika stood her ground. Her voice shook, but she forced herself to speak. "I don't believe you," she said firmly, though the tremble in her words betrayed her fear. "God is with me, and he's with you too, Hiroshi. I won't give up on you." For a brief moment, the darkness in Hiroshi's eyes flickered, as though something deep within him had heard her, struggling to break free. But just as quickly, the shadow returned, and his expression twisted into something far more sinister. He stood from the bed, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. "You're a fool, Mika," the voice sneered, growing louder, more menacing. "You think your God can protect you? He can't even protect himself. This place, this house, it belongs to me now. And soon, so will you." The room seemed to darken, the shadows stretching across the walls like creeping tendrils, reaching out towards Mika. The air grew heavy, thick with the oppressive presence of the malevolent spirit that had taken root in her brother. It pressed down on her, making it difficult to breathe, as though the very life was being sucked from the room. But Mika, though terrified, refused to back down. She clutched the Bible that she always carried with her, holding it close to her chest as if drawing strength from its presence. Her hands trembled, her heart pounded, but she would not leave her brother to this darkness. "I won't let you take him," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own racing heartbeat. I won't let you win. The figure before her, wearing her brother's face, but speaking with the voice of something far darker, only laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed in the room. But Mika held firm. She knew that whatever this was, it thrived on fear, and though she was afraid, her love for Hiroshi was stronger. Without another word, she turned and fled the room, her heart pounding as she slammed the door behind her. For the first time in her life, she felt truly helpless. What she had just faced was beyond anything she had ever imagined. It wasn't just her brother she was fighting for, it was his very soul. Tears streamed down Mika's face as she collapsed onto the floor outside Hiroshi's room. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her chest tight with fear and sorrow. The weight of the situation crashed down on her like a wave, threatening to drown her in despair. But in that moment, as she sat trembling on the cold floor, something stirred deep within her. She wasn't alone. God hadn't abandoned her, even if the darkness in that room wanted her to believe so. Mika wiped the tears from her eyes and slowly stood, determination settling in her heart. This wasn't over. Not yet. She would not give up on Hiroshi. Part 3. A Divine Encounter. The snowstorm hit Nagano with a force unlike any Mika had seen in years. The wind howled, battering against the walls of every home, shaking the trees and piling snow in heavy drifts that covered the village roads. The sky was dark, heavy with clouds, and the storm seemed relentless. Despite the ferocity of the weather, Mika wrapped herself in her thick woolen coat and trudged through the knee-deep snow, her heart racing as she made her way toward the village chapel. The chapel was small, simple, made of old wooden beams that creaked under the weight of the snow. It sat at the edge of the village, nestled against the mountainside, where it had stood for decades as a place of refuge and hope for the Christian community. Mika had spent countless hours there, praying alone, seeking comfort in the quiet sanctuary it offered. But tonight her prayers were different. They were desperate, urgent, a plea for the intervention she so desperately needed. As she approached the chapel, the storm seemed to intensify, the wind pushing against her like an invisible hand trying to hold her back. But she pressed on, her legs aching from the effort, her breath visible in the cold night air. By the time she reached the heavy wooden doors, her fingers were numb, and her body trembled, not just from the cold but from the weight of everything she was facing. She pulled the door open with a grunt, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside, closing it quickly behind her to keep the storm out. Inside the chapel, it was dark, save for the soft glow of the few candles left burning at the altar. The faint scent of incense still lingered in the air, and the silence was deafening compared to the roar of the storm outside. Mika's footsteps echoed on the stone floor as she walked toward the altar, her heart pounding in her chest. She dropped to her knees before the cross, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, and bowed her head, her tears falling freely. "God," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I need you. I don't know what to do anymore. Hiroshi is slipping away, and I can't reach him. I've tried everything, and nothing is working. Please show me the way." The silence in the chapel stretched out, the only sound the distant howl of the wind outside. Mika felt so small, so helpless, as if the very world was crumbling around her and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Her tears soaked into the fabric of her coat as she cried, her hands gripping the wooden pew in front of her. "I'm losing him," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm losing my brother." Mika's heart ached with the weight of her sorrow. She had never felt so alone. For days, she had prayed, but the heavens had remained silent. She had fasted, hoping for clarity, but nothing had come. Now, kneeling in the dim light of the chapel, her strength was nearly gone. Her body was weak from hunger, her spirit crushed under the weight of her failure. All she wanted was to save Hiroshi, but how could she fight something she didn't understand? For a moment, she thought of giving up, of returning home and accepting that this darkness, this evil that had taken hold of her brother, was too powerful for her to overcome. But something deep inside her, a flicker of the faith she had carried all her life, refused to let her give in. She could not surrender. Not now. Mika took a deep breath and closed her eyes, forcing herself to focus on the only thing that could give her strength, her faith. She began to pray again, her words soft at first, but growing stronger with each breath. God, please hear me. Give me the strength to save him. Give me the courage to face whatever this is. Show me the way. As she prayed, something changed. The air in the chapel seemed to shift, growing warmer despite the cold storm raging outside. Mika felt a strange sensation, like a presence filling the room, wrapping around her like a comforting embrace. Her breath caught in her throat, and she opened her eyes slowly, blinking against the soft glow that began to fill the space. At first, she thought it was the candles, their flames flickering brighter for a moment. But then the light grew, becoming stronger, warmer, and more radiant, until it filled the entire chapel. Mika's heart raced as she looked around, her eyes wide with awe and wonder. The glow wasn't coming from the candles. It was something else, something divine. And then she saw it. A figure began to materialize in front of the altar, its form glowing with an ethereal light that was both soft and blinding at the same time. Mika gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as she stared in disbelief. The figure stood tall, with wings that stretched out behind it, shimmering like the purest snow under the morning sun. Its face was calm, serene, and its eyes glowed with a light that seemed to pierce through every fear, every doubt Mika had carried with her. It was an angel. Mika's knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor, overcome by the sheer awe of the presence before her. Tears flowed freely down her cheeks as she bowed her head, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never seen anything like this, never imagined that something so divine, so otherworldly, could stand before her in this small, humble chapel. Mika, the angel's voice was soft yet powerful, echoing through the chapel like the wind through the mountains. It wasn't a voice that came from the mouth, but from somewhere deeper, resonating in Mika's soul. You have been heard. Your prayers have reached the heavens, and you have not been abandoned. Mika could barely breathe, her body trembling as she knelt before the angel. What must I do?" she managed to whisper, her voice thick with emotion. The angel stepped closer, its radiant light bathing Mika in warmth and peace. "Your brother is not lost," it said, its voice gentle yet firm. "But the darkness that has taken hold of him is strong. You cannot fight it alone." Mika looked up, her eyes filled with desperation. "But I don't know how to save him," she cried, her voice breaking. "I've tried everything. I've prayed, I've fasted, I've begged, but nothing has worked." The angel reached out, placing a hand on Mika's shoulder. The touch was gentle, but it sent a surge of strength through her, as if the very power of the heavens was flowing into her. "You have not failed," the angel said softly. "But now, you must face this darkness with the strength of your faith. Do not let fear guide you. Let your love for your brother and your faith in God be your weapons." Mika's heart swelled with emotion. The warmth of the angel's presence filled her with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in weeks. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, she felt hope, real, tangible hope, that she could save Hiroshi. "But how?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "How can I fight something like this?" The angel's eyes softened, and it knelt before her, bringing its face close to hers. "God's light is stronger than any darkness," it said. "But you must believe. When the time comes, do not waver. Do not doubt. Stand firm in your faith, and the darkness will be cast out." Mika nodded, her tears falling freely now as she stared into the angel's glowing eyes. "I will," she whispered. "I won't give up on him." The angel smiled, a soft, serene smile that filled Mika's heart with warmth. "Go now," it said, rising to its full height. "Prepare yourself. The battle will be fierce, but you are not alone. God's light is with you." And with those final words, the angel's form began to fade, the light dimming until the chapel was once again shrouded in the soft glow of the candles. The warmth lingered, though, filling Mika with a newfound sense of purpose and determination. For the first time in weeks, Mika stood tall, her heart steady, her faith unshakable. She had been given a sign, a divine message that she could save her brother. She would not face this battle alone. With renewed strength, Mika turned and left the chapel, stepping out into the raging snowstorm. The wind whipped at her face, but she barely felt it. Her path was clear now. She would return home and face the darkness head-on. And this time, she would not falter. Part 4. The Confrontation. The blizzard continued to rage outside as Mika returned home. The wind screamed through the trees, and the snow whipped against the windows like 1,000 icy needles. The house, once a warm haven, now felt like a prison. Its wooden beams groaned under the weight of the storm, and the fire in the hearth struggled to keep the room warm. But Mika was no longer afraid. After her encounter with the angel, she felt a powerful sense of purpose coursing through her veins. The fear that had once paralyzed her was gone, replaced by a fierce determination to save her brother. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a firm thud. The house was silent, eerily so, as though it were holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Mika could feel the oppressive presence that lingered in the air, the darkness that had taken root in her brother seeping through the walls. But now, she was ready. She clutched her Bible tightly in her hand, her fingers wrapped around its worn leather cover as though it were her only lifeline. "Hiroshi," she called, her voice steady and strong, though her heart pounded in her chest. "I'm here." There was no answer at first, only the low moan of the wind outside and the crackling of the dying fire. Mika took a deep breath, her resolve unshakable. She walked further into the house, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floorboards. Her eyes scanned the shadows, searching for any sign of her brother. "Hiroshi," she called again, her voice firmer this time. "I know you're still in there. I know you can hear me." A low, guttural laugh echoed from the shadows, sending a chill down Mika's spine. She turned toward the sound, her heart skipping a beat as her eyes fell on her brother. He stood in the doorway of the living room, his body twisted and contorted in unnatural ways. His once bright eyes were now pools of darkness, his face pale and gaunt, almost unrecognizable. The smile that stretched across his lips was cruel, mocking. "You're too late." The voice that came from Hiroshi's mouth was not his own. It was deep, gravelly, dripping with malice. "He's gone. You've lost him." Mika's heart ached at the sight of her brother, but she didn't let the pain show. She took a step forward, her Bible held out in front of her like a shield. "No," she said firmly, her voice steady. "You don't belong here. I command you to leave my brother. In the name of Jesus Christ, you have no power here." Hiroshi's body convulsed violently at her words, his limbs jerking as though pulled by invisible strings. The thing inside him let out a hiss, its dark eyes narrowing as it glared at Mika. "You think your faith can save him?" It sneered, its voice filled with venom. "You're a fool." But Mika didn't waver. She stepped closer, her grip on the Bible tightening as she began to recite verses, her voice filled with conviction. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul." The room seemed to shift around her, the shadows flickering as if in response to her words. Hiroshi's body writhed, his face contorted in pain as the darkness inside him fought back. But Mika's faith was stronger. She continued to pray, her voice rising above the storm that raged outside. "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." Hiroshi let out a scream, a sound so guttural and primal that it sent shockwaves through the house. The very air seemed to tremble with the force of it, but Mika didn't flinch. She held her ground, her heart pounding in her chest, but her resolve unbreakable. "You are not welcome here," she said again, her voice like steel. "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to leave this place." The darkness inside Hiroshi roared in defiance, but it was weakening. Mika could see it in the way his body shuddered, the way the malevolent presence that had taken hold of him seemed to waver. She pressed on, her prayers becoming more fervent, her faith like a beacon of light in the encroaching darkness. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. The light from the fire in the hearth suddenly flared, casting long shadows across the room. The temperature seemed to plummet, and Mika's breath came out in visible puffs in the freezing air. Hiroshi's body jerked violently, his head snapping back, his eyes rolling into the back of his skull as another scream tore from his throat. Mika felt the presence in the room shift, as though something was being pushed back, forced out. She knew she was close. "You have no power here," she cried, her voice filled with authority. "In the name of Jesus Christ, you must leave." The house seemed to tremble, the very walls shaking as if in response to the spiritual battle taking place within. The storm outside raged on, but inside there was a different kind of storm, one that had nothing to do with the wind or snow. Mika's words were weapons, each prayer a strike against the darkness that had invaded her brother. Hiroshi's body twisted, his limbs flailing as the darkness fought to remain. But Mika would not let it win. She continued to pray, her voice unwavering, her faith a force that could not be broken. And then, suddenly, the room grew still. Hiroshi's body slumped to the floor, motionless, as though the life had been drained from him. Mika's heart pounded in her chest as she rushed to his side, dropping to her knees beside him. "Hiroshi," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Hiroshi, can you hear me?" For a long moment, there was no response. The house was silent, save for the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of the storm outside. Mika's heart sank, fear gripping her once again. Had she been too late? Had the darkness taken him for good? But then, slowly, Hiroshi stirred. His eyes fluttered open, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, they were clear. The darkness was gone. "Mika," he whispered, his voice weak but his own. Tears of relief filled Mika's eyes as she reached out, taking his hand in hers. "You're okay," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're safe now." Hiroshi's eyes filled with confusion as he looked up at her, his brow furrowed. What happened?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Mika smiled through her tears, her heart swelling with gratitude. "It's over," she said softly. "You're free." But deep down, Mika knew that the battle wasn't truly over. The storm outside still raged, and the house still felt heavy with the lingering presence of the darkness that had plagued them. She had won this fight, but there would be more battles to come. For now, though, she was content. Her brother was safe, and that was all that mattered. Mika helped Hiroshi to his feet, guiding him toward the warmth of the fire. The light flickered, casting long shadows on the walls, but Mika didn't feel afraid anymore. She had faced the darkness and come out stronger. And as they sat together by the hearth, the storm still howling outside, Mika whispered a prayer of thanks, knowing that God had been with her every step of the way. The fight had been long and hard, but Mika's faith had carried her through. And now, with her brother by her side, she knew that no matter what came next, she would be ready. Part 5. Liberation. As dawn began to break over the snow-covered mountains, a soft golden light spilled through the windows of Mika's house, casting long shadows across the floor. The storm had passed, leaving behind a stillness that was almost eerie. The air was crisp and cold, yet peaceful, as if the entire world had taken a deep breath and was now holding it. Inside the house, the warmth of the fire had begun to return, filling the space with a soft glow, but Mika's heart still raced as she looked at Hiroshi, slumped in exhaustion. Mika knelt beside him, watching his chest rise and fall in slow, shallow breaths. The darkness that had held him captive for so long was gone, but the memory of it lingered, a shadow in the corners of the room. She gently touched his forehead, feeling the warmth of his skin, her heart swelling with relief. Her brother was free, but the battle had taken its toll on them both. The house itself, which had felt oppressive and heavy during the struggle, now seemed lighter. The darkness that had once clung to the walls filling the air with an almost suffocating presence, had lifted. The weight that had pressed down on Mika for days, that had made her doubt her faith and fear for her brother's soul, was gone. The silence that now filled the space was no longer ominous, but calming, a quiet after the storm. Hiroshi stirred, his eyes fluttering open slowly, blinking against the morning light that streamed through the frost-covered windows. For a moment, he looked confused, disoriented, as though he had woken from a long and terrible dream. Mika's breath caught in her throat as she watched him, waiting for any sign that her brother had truly returned to her. "Mika," his voice was soft, barely a whisper, but it was his voice, his true voice, free of the dark, twisted sound that had haunted her for weeks. Tears welled up in Mika's eyes as she smiled, her hand gently squeezing his. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "You're safe now." Hiroshi blinked, his brow furrowing as he tried to piece together the fragments of his memory. He looked around the room, his eyes filled with confusion, and then his gaze settled on Mika. What happened?" he asked, his voice rough, as if he had not spoken in days. Mika's heart ached at the sight of him. He looked so frail, so vulnerable, like a child lost in a world he didn't recognize. She wanted to explain everything, to tell him about the battle they had fought, the darkness they had faced, but the words wouldn't come. All she could do was reach out and brush a strand of hair from his forehead, her touch gentle and full of love. "You were sick," she said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. "But you're better now. You're free." Hiroshi's eyes widened slightly as he tried to make sense of what she was saying. "Free," he repeated, his voice barely audible. "From what?" Mika hesitated, unsure of how much he remembered, or how much she should tell him. The darkness that had possessed him was gone, but the scars it had left behind were still fresh, still raw. She didn't want to overwhelm him. Not now. Not when he was so fragile. "From something terrible," Mika finally said, her voice quiet but firm. "But it's over now. You don't have to worry about it anymore." Hiroshi's hand tightened around hers, and for a moment, they sat in silence, the only sound the faint crackling of the fire in the hearth. The warmth of the room began to seep into Mika's bones, chasing away the cold that had settled deep inside her during the long days and nights of fighting for her brother's soul. "I remember voices," Hiroshi said after a long pause, his brow furrowed as he tried to recall the fragments of his nightmare. "And darkness. I couldn't see anything, but I knew it was there, watching me, waiting." Mika felt a chill run down her spine at his words, but she forced herself to remain calm. "It's gone now," she said firmly. "You're safe." Hiroshi nodded slowly, though the confusion in his eyes didn't completely fade. He looked down at their joined hands, his thumb brushing lightly over the back of her hand, as if grounding himself in the reality of her presence. How did you save me?" Mika smiled, though tears still glistened in her eyes. "It wasn't me," she said softly. "It was God. He was with me the whole time. He gave me the strength to fight for you, to bring you back." Hiroshi's eyes widened at her words, a flicker of something. Awe, disbelief, gratitude, passing over his face. He had never been as devout as Mika, always the skeptic, always questioning the faith that had been such a central part of their lives. But now, as he looked into his sister's eyes, he saw something there that he couldn't deny. Something powerful, something real. "I don't know how to thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to," Mika said, squeezing his hand. "You're my brother. I would do anything for you." The room was quiet again, the tension that had once filled it replaced by a profound sense of peace. The light from the rising sun spilled across the floor, bathing everything in a soft, golden glow. Outside, the world was still, the snow blanketing the mountains in a perfect, untouched whiteness. It was as if the storm had never happened, as if the world had been washed clean, reborn in the light of a new day. For a long time, they sat together in the warmth of the fire, not speaking, just being. Mika's heart swelled with gratitude, not just for her brother's return, but for the strength she had found in her faith. She had faced the darkness and come out on the other side, her bond with Hiroshi stronger than ever before. As the morning wore on, Hiroshi began to regain his strength. Mika helped him to his feet, guiding him toward the kitchen where she had prepared a simple meal of rice and miso soup. He ate slowly, his hands still trembling slightly, but the color began to return to his cheeks, and with each bite, he seemed more like himself. "I'm sorry," Hiroshi said suddenly, his voice quiet but filled with sincerity. "For everything. For scaring you. For whatever happened. I don't remember all of it, but I know it was bad. I'm so sorry." Mika shook her head, reaching across the table to take his hand. "You don't have to apologize," she said gently. "None of this was your fault. You were lost, but you're here now. That's all that matters." Hiroshi's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, he looked as though he might break down. But instead, he took a deep breath and nodded, squeezing her hand in silent thanks. After breakfast, they sat together by the fire, watching as the sun climbed higher in the sky, melting away the remnants of the storm. The world outside seemed so peaceful, so perfect, that it was hard to believe the darkness they had faced only hours before. Hiroshi leaned back in his chair, his eyes closed as he soaked in the warmth of the fire. "Mika," he said after a long pause, his voice thoughtful, Do you think God really was with us?" Mika looked at him, her heart swelling with love for her brother. "I know he was," she said softly. "I felt him with me, guiding me, and I know he was with you too, even when you couldn't feel it." Hiroshi opened his eyes and looked at her, his expression one of quiet awe. "I'm not sure I understand all of it," he admitted, "but maybe that's okay." Mika smiled, her heart light. "It's more than okay," she said. "Faith doesn't always mean having all the answers. Sometimes it's just knowing that you're not alone." The sun continued to rise, casting long, golden rays across the room. The storm was over, and the world was bathed in light. Mika and Hiroshi sat together, their hearts full of gratitude, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together, with faith, with love, and with the strength that had carried them through the darkest of nights. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and experiences. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, God bless you.